Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Live from my kitchen table. Special hello to the BOC family, friends of the BOC, the naysayers, and the sovereignties and authorities in the high celestial places. We are on the second to last part of the Problem of Sin and the Judgment of God series. We are on part 9 of part 2, and this is on the second death. Death is the designation which God himself has placed upon the lake of fire to describe its effect upon those who are condemned at the great white throne. Our thoughts about the burning lake are usually the very opposite of this. We imagine it a place of torture, of pain prolonged and excruciating, of terror and despair, of hopelessness and helpless horror. Few of our false notions are as difficult to displace as this, for this same lake will be a place of torment for a few others who have never died before. And our experience with fire has left us with a sense of the anguish which it afflicts, whether we have been burned ourselves or have seen others writhing in its flames. It is a triumph of faith to face all of this and rest on God's simple word. This is the second death, the lake of fire. In death, there is no sensation whatsoever, no pain or pleasure, no despair and no delight. We will never understand the lake of fire or God's purpose in it until we clear it of all of the false notions with which we have invested it and simply believe that it is oblivion, death, in which all sensation ceases and all consciousness of time and of place vanishes. Its victims awake only when they reach their journey's end, when death is abolished and God becomes their all. Death is a figure. The sum of men's thoughts seem to be infinite. A number of words to express them is limited. Hence, it is necessary to use words for ideas outside of their strict significance. This is done in figures of speech. Adjacent realms of thought are often covered by one expression. This is especially true of the term death. The meaning is clear. It is a return of the spirit to God, of the soul to the unseen, and of the body to the soil. It is an analysis, a dissolution of man into his components. This agrees with the fact that there is no consciousness in death. That this is the actual literal meaning of the term is put beyond all doubt by the fact that this feature of death is implied in some of its figurative uses. A man who is sound asleep is dead to the world. Unbelievers are dead to God. But there are passages which seem to imply that the dead are conscious and that these vitally concern the second death. Death and the unseen are pictured as the receptacle of the dead when they give up the dead in them to stand before the great white throne in Revelation 20:13. The death state cannot literally contain the dead or disgorge them. It is a marvelous expressive way of saying that those who have died are raised. And it is highly significant that this resurrection does not mention the spirit, for this would vivify them, but the soul. The consciousness is especially included by using the same figure of the unseen. The dead stand before the great white throne with their bodies and souls. How to express the fact that they literally have spirit, or they could not have a soul, but are not vivified as the saints, would take considerable explanation. It is done most vividly by calling them dead and omitting any mention of spirit, i.e., when these people are resurrected, this is not the vivification, where vivification is uniquely tied with the spirit of God. The fact that they just have, I wouldn't say just have, but so the fact that they are mostly body and soul at this point during the judging, and the fact that they haven't been given God's spirit that would vivify them, they are to be referred to as the dead. So that way there is no mixing up what resurrection this is. And even with that caveat, we still have people such as our dear favorite naysayer, Eric Leinhart, who say that the resurrection of judgment is, in fact, the vivification when it's clearly not. Then the same words are used again, but the figure is slightly changed. Death and the unseen are cast into the lake of fire, Revelation 20:14. Here the inhabitants, the persons who have died, are intended by the term death. We use this figure freely in other connections. We speak of the city or of the country being blotted out by a catastrophe when we really mean that the dwellers in these places, It is not quite evident from the double use of the terms death and the unseen that all those who stand before the great white throne are cast into the lake of fire also. The figure reverts to the condition of those before the throne ere they come out of the dead and the unseen. The chief source of confusion with regard to the death state, however, lies in those passages where by association the term death is used of its cause. In fact, Webster's dictionary, which is the authority for the meaning of the words in the United States, actually includes the act of dying as one of its definitions. That is the chief fault of this as well as other works of this kind. They define words by including their figurative uses, and thus they really diffuse the meaning and rob the language of definition. Words have a constant meaning, yet their figurative uses are not constant, but many vary in the same context, as we have already seen. There is hardly any limit to the figurative uses, to the figurative usages. Webster mentions personification and likeness, and even the cause, among others, as they were the means of the word. But even this great work does not mention the figures already discussed, the receptacle and the inhabitants of the death state. The cause of death is too often confused with the literal death state. A living, lively man may be the death of the party if the participants become like the dead because of his activities. Yet no one will insist that he is the death state. But it is our study of the scriptures we seem to be blind to such obvious figures of speech. The death of the cross is one of the most marvelous of the passages where the cause overshadows the death state. The shame and ignominy which attended Christ's decease is vigorously voiced by this famous figure. The same thought comes out in the pains of death, see Acts 2:24, the suffering of death, Hebrews 2:9. This figure is implied in the phrase, what death? He was about to be dying and glorifying God, John 12:33, 18:32, and 21:19. A less dreadful allusion to the crisis of dying is found in the phrase tasting death, see Mark 9:1 and Hebrews 2:9. This seems to have been the common figure for the end of life. Death itself is not a substance which the tongue can taste, and there is no taste or any other sensation in the literal death state. The word injure, Revelation 2:11, does not imply sensation, for land, Revelation 7:2, and grass, Revelation 9:4, and olive oil, Revelation 6:6, may be injured. The lake, not literal death. Fire is not literal death. I have seen tremendous flames spouting from an oil well with a white cloud continually hovering over it, yet no one called it death. I have seen the fumes of Vesuvius, and there was no death. Yet since then, Vesuvius has been the death of many. A friend once told me that he nearly lost his life on Kilauea, the volcano on the Hawaiian Islands. It almost became his death. This was perhaps the nearest that we can come to a lake of fire. Everyone will acknowledge that these craters are not literally the death state, yet the same situation exists in regards to the lake of fire. It is not literal death, but the cause of death. To derive the literal meaning of death from the figurative usage would almost reverse its actual definition. The death, which is cast into the lake of fire, becomes the lake of fire. This is impossibly literal. Yet in figure, the use of the same term, even for different figures, identifies the literal death caused by the lake of fire. It was the first death that gave up the dead. This is confirmed by calling it the second death. Two things must be intrinsically the same, or they cannot be related as first and second. The first death in view in this passage was not the crisis of dying, for that cannot give up the dead in it. Indeed, that cannot well be the basis of any figure itself. Neither can such a death be cast into the lake of fire. The first death is confined to the literal death state, so this must be true of the second. All the more so, as it is also the explanation of the function of the lake of fire. Literal, if possible, once we obey this axiom and allow the literal lake its literal result, which is death, with its literal effect of oblivion, all difficulties disappear. It fits in with all other revelation and God's great plan for the race. It may last for as many as 20,000 years, a period of purgatory and fire that would be unbearable for mortals and altogether a variance with God's judgment of individuals elsewhere. It would be impossible to reconcile his ways and his great purpose to reconcile all with the submergence of infants in a fiery lake for conscious discipline for even a minute, yet alone many millenniums. The function of the first death was to bring all into judgment immediately at the end of life. So the second death ushered all into reconciliation as soon as they have been judged. What does the second death actually accomplish? To be sure, it involves the loss of the bliss and glory which comes to those who have believed and who have the free gift of immortality. But for those who do not possess this gracious gift, it is a most merciful alternative. Men view their lives from the standpoint of experience and consciousness. What occurs to us when we are asleep or unconscious does not affect our happiness at the time. We cannot admire God's wisdom enough in that he has made death a state of absolute oblivion. It simplifies his dealings with his creatures enormously and makes it possible for him to be just and equitable. How anyone could justify God in holding the antediluvian world in conscious suspense for thousands of years before bringing them into judgment is inexplicable. Let us never accuse him of such a crime. To a human being who judges by his consciousness, there is no interval of time between death and resurrection. Abel, the first man to die, will be raised, or rather vivified, nearly 6,000 years ago, so far as he will be aware at the instant of his awakening. It is even possible, should it happen that he was begging for mercy at the time of his death and expired with an unfinished sentence on his lips, that he will complete the petition before he realizes what has occurred. I remember the case of a Hollander who had been struck on the head while issuing an order and injured so that he partially lost his mind. When an operation relieved the pressure on a certain part of his brain, the first thing he did was to finish the command to his workmen, which had been interrupted by the accident. The time between was a total blank. So it will be with the believer. I feel certain that many saints who have ardently waited for the coming of Christ will awake under the impression that he came just as they were about to die or during their lifetime. Indeed, has he not wisely planned it so that he comes to every one of his own at the close of their course, and yet this occurs at the same instant for them all? That is the ideal, and God is able to attain it. Not death, but his coming. It is set before each one of his beloved, and, for all practical purposes, this is what takes place. Experimentally, though not actually, every time a saint dies, the Lord comes in glory and gathers him to him, together with all other saints of this economy, whether past or future. Impossible, but true. And who would have it otherwise? Can his imitable wisdom be excelled? A shimmer of this glorious wisdom falls upon the unbelieving dead. They also wake to find themselves with all their kind of every age and every climate before the judge of all the earth. And when they die again, it will not be a long, dreary, unbearable suspense, but a instantaneous entrance into the glories of the consummation. For them, the last eon will have no existence. For them, we must fold our charts so that the consummation immediately follows the great white throne. For them, the lake of fire is immediately transformed into the ineffable bliss which even we, his saints, but feebly apprehend, which comes only to those in whom in whom God is all. Some will object that this casting of them into eternal bliss rather than into the lake of fire. Such an objector has at least understood my words, even if he has missed their spirit, and has forgotten that at this time the dead have been judged. It is I who am the stickler for a literal interpretation. I am not making the lake figurative, hoping thus to erase my heart at the expense of my head, or not erase, but ease my heart at the expense of my head. The casting and the fire and the death are all as literal as they can be. The death here spoken of, being given in a definition, must be literal. As literal fire produces literal death, it also is literal. There is only one literal interpretation possible, and it is supremely satisfactory. Various figurative interpretations have been offered. None of them have proved permanently tenable. They all arise from faulty views of judgment and of death and are futile once these are clearly grasped. Now, before we move on, I have to say I have a personal, though scripture-based preference in what the lake of fire is, and I disagree with this interpretation that they die. Those who are cast into the lake of fire, they die by the flames for various purposes. For one, God calls the literal burning of people an abomination. You can find this in Jeremiah chapters, I believe it's 7, 18, and 32. And he speaks of it being an abomination, the burning of their sons and daughters in the fires of Molech. Of course, you'll have people that come up to you and say, well, he was condemning the child sacrifice, and not just child sacrifice, but child sacrifice to false gods nonetheless. But that doesn't, I think, take into account that this particular form of child sacrifice was in fact the thing being condemned along with the idolatry. And the reason I say that is because at the time, there were many different forms of child sacrifice going on at the time in those cultures. You had child sacrifice by stabbing, as we saw Abraham almost do with Isaac. You had child sacrifice by drowning them in rivers and lakes and the sea. You had child sacrifice by strangulation. And then, of course, you had child sacrifice by burning them in fire. And I think it's very telling that God explicitly calls out burning them alive as the abomination. He could have said any form of child sacrifice is an abomination, but he doesn't. He specifically calls out child sacrifice by fire. In addition, the law was a tit-for-tat justice system. So everything that you did was supposed to be handled in a just way that equally resulted in the offense that you did. And those who sacrificed their children in fire were not reciprocated by being burned alive also. They were stoned to death. On top of that, you have some laws that said people who not created, but they committed certain types of sexual immoralities, like a man laying with a mother and daughter, and a priest's daughter that ends up being a prostitute, were to be burned. And of course, everyone thinks that this is burned alive, but when you look at how the law was interpreted, especially in the earliest rabbinic teachings, no one was ever burned alive. They were stoned to death first and then burned alive. And we see a similar judgment happen to, I forget his name, but it's in the book of Joshua. There was a traitor among them, and they stoned him to death and then burned his remains as a added on punishment, a disgraceful burial. And this also goes in line with the judgments of Gehenna. All criminals who were convicted of the worst crimes were also to have their remains burned in the fires of Gehenna in the field or the dump. This was done as an added on punishment. They were not burned to death. They were killed first and then their remains burned. So if we're going to take all of this into account, the heart of God saying that burning people alive unto death, even if it's is an abomination, and then on top of that, any and all forms of judgmental burnings are done after the person is dead, I think we have sufficient evidence to say that God doesn't kill the people he judges in the great white throne of judgment by throwing them into the lake of fire. I believe that they are killed first and then their bodies are thrown into the lake of fire and cremated. I think we can also say this because we see in the Pentecostal story of Acts, Ananias and Sapphira, as soon as they were judged guilty for hoarding the money that was supposed to go to the kingdom, they dropped dead on the spot. and then they were entombed elsewhere. And of course, they weren't burned, but at the same time, the fact that they just were judged instantly and dropped dead, I think, is sufficient evidence to show that those who are judged in the great white throne of judgment will probably most likely drop dead too, and then their remains will be cremated as such. And from this viewpoint, can we not see the absolute necessity of the fire? It is not to torture the sinner, but to do away with sin. God cannot be all in mortal men. He will not dwell in corruptible bodies. They must be made fit for his august presence. And what can picture and also provide such a complete destruction of all this that is pernicious in man as to dissolve him into his elements? Ashes are clean, yes, cleansing. Fire is the best purifier. In fact, it is probable that our ideas of purity come from pur, the Greek word for fire. The utter destruction of the sinner by the lake of fire clears the grounds for his vivification as a temple of God at the consummation. Is not all of this harmonious and satisfying? Yes, comforting and glorious. And this is no purgatory. It is quite the opposite. The sinner feels and does hardly anything. There is no conscious, long-lasting torture, no gradual cleansing of the old, no miraculous life within the flames of death. Nothing is strained. All is natural. Man is debased and God is glorified. All of God's destructive processes have been comparatively swift. Why should not his last be the swiftest? Let us always remember that the casting into the fire comes after the dead have been judged and all has been set right. The indignation and fury, affliction and distress, which comes on every human soul who afflicts evil, Romans 2:9, has been experienced. So I think that also goes to show that there is no more torture after the judgment. They probably give up the spirit right there, and then their remains are burned away. It is a part of the judging that will then be passed. The death in the lake of fire is not part of the judging. It is not a place of torment for those who are mortal. And a fun fact, the word for torment right here in regards to the lake of fire, the three beings that are tormented, Satan, the false prophet, and the wild beast. The word there is basano, or the bassino, and it just means to reveal under pressure, to distress, and to test. So the torment there isn't even what we would automatically jump to. It's not them being in pain. It's them being unmasked. It's them being distressed, and that I would think, since they're being reconciled back to God, they're probably going to be in great distress in the lake of fire over everything that they have done. And I'll do a further study on that after the show. The problem as to the condition of those who have been judged between I thought that highlight. There we go. The problem as to the condition of those who have been judged between this time and their reconciliation to God at the consummation is a difficult one if we seek to solve it apart from revelation. If our hearts are in tune with God, we will wish them to experience immediate reconciliation. If our heads are in harmony with his great aeonian purpose, we will not reconcile them until after the eons are over. And God, in his inevitable wisdom, does both of these by introducing the second death. Why do they not receive aeonian life, yet they experience immediate deathlessness? We rightly think that when God has judged his creatures, he should not delay in collapsing them to his bosom. Yet we see that for his own glory and for the good of these very creatures, they must be delayed until Christ has put all other enemies beneath his feet. Death must be the last, and the second death must not yield until he has abrogated all sovereignty and authority and power, per 1 Corinthians 15:24. The last eon on the new earth has no place in its plans for the judged of mankind. That would destroy its character and its lesson. Let us never fall into common error of thinking that the great white throne is only a trial and that the sentence produced is the lake of fire. That would be a travesty of justice indeed. Why have a trial to determine the amount of guilt and the proper infliction if all, without distinction, are foredoomed to receive the same sentence? No, indeed. The trial and the sentence and its execution for all this is included in the one word judging. All take place in the interval between the first and second death of the sinner. Thus, it will be possible to be just and deal with each case according to its merits. The many differences between those who sinned much and those who have sinned little, those who sinned against light and those who sat in darkness, those who never heard of God and those who defied his name, all these will be recognized and rectified. Only thus can the judge of all the earth do right. Only so can the judgment proceed along the lines of God himself has laid down, as detailed in the early chapters of the Epistle of Romans. The main point which we seek to press upon our readers is to accept God's declaration that for those who are judged before the great white throne, the lake of fire is the second death. If we take God at his word, exactly and accurately, and add nothing to it and take nothing from it, which is a very difficult feat for us mortals, then all of our objections will vanish. He does not say that it is a painful death or a slow death or a horrible death. These are all figments of our imagination. In death, there is no pain, and death by violence need not be painful, however it may appear. We have no right whatsoever to make either the dying or the death in the lake of fire a thing to be dreaded. It is not so at all. There is every reason to think that the deluge brought much more individual suffering than the lake of fire. Yet even this is not certain. We have been taught by pictures that the waters gradually drove the people to the heights and that their end came only after days and weeks of fearful, frightful, dreadful despair. The remains of animals found in northern ice seems to hint that it may have been an instantaneous death, that a wall of water drowned the unfortunates in a moment. But in the case of the lake of fire, we are sure. The word cast, which seems so cruel at first, is really filled with mercy. It suggests a sudden and settled end. A second is all that is needed. I once had an experience which taught me a sultry lesson. I suppose the most sensitive parts of the human frame are the fingertips. At least their constant use for the purpose of touching makes them very sensitive to any contact. When I was a young man, I very foolishly undertook to cleaning parts of a printing press while it was running. With a rag, I reached far into the revolving mechanism on which still fingers opened and closed as they grasped the sheets. My rag caught and dragged my hand through, and the steel grippers tore open at least 3 fingers on my right hand. At least I still bear the scars. In fact, I can tell the approximate temperature by the lawn steam on my little finger, which will not straighten out in cold weather. Oh, you may exclaim, how painful that must have been. One person who saw it became ill and almost fainted at the sight. Everyone was so stunned that I had to take charge myself and order them to call the doctor. But I had no pain in my hand. I could see the bleeding flesh and the bare bone, but it seemed to have little sensation. If I had died then and there, I would not have suffered, except from fright. Later, I had pain aplenty, but not enough at the time to give it a name. I have heard of some similar experiences. Livingstone, the African explorer, was bitten in the shoulder by a lion, and he felt no pain at the time. I feel quite sure that animals, which are the prey of others, seldom feel the pains they are supposed to, especially if the blood flows. It is a merciful provision that sudden violence stunts the nerves so that they do not function. Death in the scriptures, that is the Greek word thanatos, always means a state consequent on dying, but in current English, it is also used for the act of dying. In our Bible, it occurs in this sense. In John 4:47, we read that the nobleman's son was at the point of death, that he was about to be dying. Usually, the context makes it the matter clear, or should do so, but that depends on the reader. When I speak of the process of death, I have taken it for granted that everyone will understand me to refer to the experience which immediately precedes the death state, not death itself. For there is no experience possible in death. When we use the word death of the cause of death, we are not really giving it a new meaning, but giving it a figurative usage. For instance, the death of the cross is not the spirit and the soul of our Lord nailed to the cross in the death state during the 3 days before his resurrection, but the experience which caused his death. Literally, it is his dying on the cross, but the figure carries us further than that. It implies the shame and ignominy, which is the portion of the worst criminal. I do not deny that gradual death by fire may be excruciating, yet such has been the portion of some of God's choicest saints. But neither nature nor revelation gives any warrant for thinking that the lake of fire is a cause of pain to any who find in it a second death. For those who live in it and are tormented, it is an entirely different matter. I have no reason for believing that a human being could live more than a few seconds in a lake of fire. Death would come almost instantly, and in that time, it is not likely that there would be appreciable suffering. It is a question just how much those who stand before the great white throne will know of their fate. We are not informed whether they are told about the lake of fire or not. This we can well leave with God. If they know it, they will have far less to dread than anyone at the present time, saint or sinner. Were men absolutely sure that at death they would be taken suddenly without previous suffering or appreciable pain, it would be a great consolation, for that sort of death is much to be preferred to the one which befalls the majority of mankind. God could have doomed those who are judged before the throne to die as they had died before, of disease, of senility, and have made its part of their judgment. But it seems to me that the purpose of such experience is to humble us, not simply to set us right. It is most probable that God's judgment will not be prolonged sufficiently to include such afflictions. We cannot look upon them as judgments, as they are the lot of mankind long before they enter into the judgment before the first death. There seems to be no indication that the second death affects the judgment at the great white throne, except that as a result of its condemnation, no aeonian life is granted to anyone, and they have no part in the blessing of the final aeon, either in the heavens or on the earth. They pass these in oblivion, death. Still further, it is scriptural to believe that it will be a release from pain in various degrees and for various periods, according to their deserts. Indignation and a fury, affliction and distress, Romans 2:9, will be the portion of those who stand before the great white throne. Men are not simply tried there, they are judged, and this continues until they are cast into the lake of fire. Then in death, all sensation ceases. It is a release, not a torture chamber. Most of us have known cases of human suffering where we have questioned the wisdom of combating death. We breathe a sigh of relief when the long last sigh has closed the case of unbearable torture. So will the lake of fire mercifully close the judgment period of all who suffer for their sins. It is not an infliction, but a cessation. It is worth our while to note that God's use of the two elements, water and fire, in his great Aeonian operations, the first 2 eons are separated by watery boundaries, the disruption and the deluge, so the last 2 eons are bounded by fire. This element plays a powerful part in the judgments which usher in the kingdom and is most prominent between the last 2 eons, for the greatest of all conflagrations will precede the new heavens and the new earth. Both in fact and in figure, fire is the final cleansing agent. So it is in utmost harmony to use this element in effecting the second death of those who will be made alive at the consummation. And with that being said, that concludes this portion of the problem of sin and the judgments of God. Let's see who's in the side chat. God bless you, dear brother Lawrence. God bless you, God bless you, God bless you. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for coming and for your support. You are loved with an everlasting love. We all are, and I thank God for that. Dear brother Alex, God bless you. Thank you so much for coming and for your support. Shabbat Shalom. Death is temporary. Abolishment of death is forever. Amen. Shuli Israel, welcome. This is my first time seeing you here. Welcome, welcome. Shabbat Shalom to you. Shalom, brethren. Need your prayers and help because I am homeless due to Hurricane Helen. Well, I think I speak for everyone here when we say we will definitely include you in our prayers. I hope you and your family end up better than when you previously started, and that God gives you the endurance to get through this current trial. And that is his PayPal, if anyone feels moved to go and donate. And with that being said, I'm going to jump on over to my notes really quick. Let's see, share screen. And I don't think that's the, yeah, my notes are all the way up at the top. Sorry about that, you guys. We will go right here. All right, this is a summary of the article. What the lake of fire really is. Most Christians wrongly imagine the lake of fire as torture, but scripture literally defines it as this is the second death in Revelation 20:14. So he argues death means non-consciousness, no pain, no feeling, no awareness. Therefore, the lake of fire is a condition of death, not torture. We have to remove cultural images of flames, torment, demons, etc., and accept the scripture's own definition. What death means in the scriptures. Death is a spirit returning to God, the soul or consciousness returning to the unseen, the body returning to the soil, and the person becoming unconscious. Death, these are figurative uses of the word death. Death to the world, dead to God, death gave up the dead, death of the cross, the process of shame and of dying. The main point is you must distinguish literal death from the figurative death. Confusing the two is what creates the doctrine of eternal torment. Revelation, figurative language. Revelation uses death and the unseen, Hades, in figurative ways, such as death and Hades gave up the dead, which is the resurrection of the dead, not the vivification, but the resurrection. Death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. The people in those states are destroyed. Key point. Like when we say the city was destroyed, meaning the people, not the literal sidewalks. Why fire equals the cause of death, not the place of torment. Volcanoes, flames, and explosions, they can cause death, but are not death itself. The lake of fire is not literal death, but the means by which God produces death. And I gave the reason as to why I think that is not true. Because any and all forms of death by fire is considered an abomination to God. And anytime God does use fire as a means of judgment, it is always after the person has been killed. You don't derive the meaning of death from the fire. You interpret the fire through the definition of death. Literal if possible. He argues that the second death must be the same kind of thing as the first death because you can't have first and second unless they are the same kind of thing. So the second death is not a super death from which nothing and no one can ever return, as the annihilationists like to point out, and as the eternal conscious torment crew likes to try to make the second death out to be. The first death is unconsciousness, so the second death must be unconsciousness as well. Noting in the text, or nothing in the text, says that the second death feels anything. Why God uses the second death. God can't reconcile mortals full of corruption. The mortal is sinful flesh that can't be vivified as God's dwelling in the here and now. Fire is the symbol of purifying and removing corruption. The lake of fire removes that corruption, which is mortal nature. It does not torture. It destroys what is incompatible with God being all in all. After the second death comes the consummation where death is abolished, all are vivified, i.e. made immortal, and God becomes all in all. The lake of fire prepares humanity for universal reconciliation by ending their mortality and corruption. The second death is not purgatory. There's no conscious purifying, no pain cleansing or painful cleansing, no prolonged suffering, and no living in fire, as popular Christian doctrine likes to try to shove down our throats. It is instantaneous. It ends the judgment period, and it places the person in unconscious death until the consummation. What happens between the judgment and the consummation? People are judged before the lake of fire, which is condemned according to their works. They're judged after judgment. They enter the second death. They remain unconscious, sleep-like until God abolishes death. To them, there is no experience of time. The author uses examples of people unconscious or knocked out temporarily to illustrate this. Key point: between the great white throne and the consummation, the death experiences no interval. Why the lake of fire is not punishment. The judgment is the consciousness part, indignation, fury, affliction, and distress, Romans 2:9. This happens before the second death. And why I also think that people are not killed by being burnt to death in the lake of fire, because that would definitely be affliction and distress, to say the least. The lake of fire is the end of judgment. This is the transition into unconsciousness, the removal of sensation, not the continuation of it. The lake of fire ends the punishment. It is not the punishment in and of itself. Why cast into fire is merciful. Cast suggests suddenness, finality, quick death, minimal suffering. He uses personal stories of accidents where the severe injury resulted in no pain at the moment because the nerves were overwhelmed. Sudden death is merciful. God ends judgment swiftly, not by torture. Why God uses the second death in his plan. It allows God to judge each person individually and justly. It keeps the Aeonian judgments intact. It maintains the integrity of the last aeon, yet brings all into reconciliation at the consummation, without anyone suffering eternally or consciously after the judgment. Second death preserves both justice and universal reconciliation. The author repeats his main argument. The lake of fire is just the second death. God said it. We must not add torture to his definition. Amen. He closes by insisting death has no sensation. The second death is merciful and instantaneous. It ends judgment and it prepares for a future vivification, aligned perfectly with 1 Corinthians 15, universal reconciliation. Now, I wanted to go to the study on the word for torment in Revelation. Can you please give the definition of the Greek word used for torment again, and show why it does not mean torture? All right. The Greek word used for torture, specifically in Revelation 20:10, when it talks about the false prophet, the wild beast, and Satan being tormented day and night for the aeons of the aeons, that word is basanizo, originally related to a touchstone, basanos, used to test the quality of gold and silver, literal meaning to test, to examine, or put to the test. So when it says that they are being basanoed or tormented, it's they are being examined, they are being tested, they are being put to the test. These are the places where it is found and often translated as torment in the book of Revelation. In context, it refers to suffering as a result of testing or severe trial, not deliberate ongoing torture. The original word relates to testing or proving, not inflicting pain for cruelty. Satan, the beast, and the false prophet are said to be tormented day and night for the aeons of the aeons. This doesn't indicate physical torture. It describes their ultimate defeat and unending ability to deceive or act, a kind of figurative suffering due to restrictions or judgment. In secular Greek, basano was used for testing metals or interrogating, which can involve discomfort, but does not necessitate pain as punishment. So the word basaiano, which again is used for the word torment, is to test, to examine, to put to the test. Translated torment in Revelation, but this is figurative and judgmental, not literal physical torture. The torment of Satan, the beast, and the false prophet represents their inability to continue evil, not suffering in flames. And with that, we are going to close shop. As you guys can probably hear in the background, I have little man locked up so I can do the show. But I thank everyone for coming and for their support, including you, dear friend Halsey. Shabbat Shalom. God bless you. Thank you so much for coming and for your support. God willing, I will see you guys all tomorrow for the next installment of the study in the book of Leviticus. Until then, love, grace, and peace, and Shabbat Shalom.